DE. Bread was once a weapon, not metaphorically, actually lethal. For most of the 19th century, the cheapest loaf you could buy in London or Paris might contain chalk, bone ash, sawdust, or white lead, and everyone knew it. Today we treat bread as the safest, most fundamental food. It anchors every nutrition guide. We call something the staff of life, and we mean bread. The phrase "our daily bread" carries the weight of survival itself. When we think of food adulteration, we imagine rare scandals, not standard practice. But before food safety laws existed, there was no standard. There was only price. And the story of how price alone shaped what ended up in the cheapest loaf is stranger and more consequential than the history books tend to admit. In the early 1800s, most urban workers in Europe spent more than half their income on bread. A penny difference per loaf determined whether a family ate or went hungry. Bakers competed on price, and the market responded with a simple, terrible innovation. Make the loaf whiter, lighter, and cheaper by adding anything that looked like flour. White bread was a status symbol. Brown bread, made from whole grain, marked you as poor. Millers and bakers discovered that mixing chalk, alum, and ground bones into dough produced a whiter crumb at a fraction of the cost. By the 1820s, this was standard practice in working-class bakeries across London. It was not a secret operation. It was a business model. The adulterants were sold openly. A chemist named Frederick Accum documented this publicly in 1820. He catalogued the additives by name and explained exactly how each one worked. Alum made dough rise faster and whitened low-quality flour. Chalk added weight. Bone ash provided bulk. And white lead, a substance known even then to be poisonous, delivered the brightest, most desirable color. Accum's work caused a brief scandal, but no legal reform. Bakers and millers argued that adulteration made bread affordable. Without it, they said, the poor would starve. The argument held because it was partly true. Regulation would raise prices. Wages were not rising to meet them. And so the practice continued, and it worsened. What makes this history difficult to dismiss as simple villainy is that it operated inside a genuine economic trap. The people most harmed by adulterated bread were also the people who most needed cheap bread to survive. The bakers were not largely wealthy men profiting at leisure. Many were themselves struggling, buying the cheapest raw materials available in a market that had no mechanism for rewarding purity and no penalty for poison. That is not a defense. It is the mechanism. Understanding it matters because the same mechanism has reappeared in different forms in every era since. By the 1850s, the Lancet, Britain's leading medical journal, began publishing systematic chemical analyses of common foods. Their investigators bought bread from ordinary bakeries, tested it in laboratories, and published the results. They found alum in more than half the loaves they sampled. They found chalk and plaster of Paris in nearly as many. One sample contained enough copper sulfate to produce visible green streaks in the crumb. The Lancet's findings were not seriously contested. Bakers admitted the additives. Some defended them as necessary. Others claimed the substances were harmless in small amounts. But the evidence of harm was mounting. Doctors reported chronic stomach pain, convulsions, and paralysis in families who ate adulterated bread daily. Children were especially vulnerable. White lead, in particular, caused slow, cumulative poisoning. Symptoms included abdominal pain, muscle weakness, and eventually neurological damage. The system sustained itself through economic pressure and legal inertia. Britain had no enforcement mechanism for food purity. Adulteration was technically illegal under old common law, but proving it in court required a chemist, a willing plaintiff, and a legal process that almost no working family could afford to pursue. The baking industry was simply too embedded in the supply of basic survival for the authorities to move against it without an undeniable public trigger. That trigger came in 1860 in Bradford. A confectioner sold peppermint lozenges at a market stall. The lozenges were supposed to contain sugar. They contained arsenic. The confectioner had bought what he believed was powdered sugar from a supplier who had accidentally shipped white arsenic trioxide in its place. 20 people were poisoned. Several died. The case became national news, not because adulteration was unusual, but because this one was instantly lethal and impossible to reframe as an acceptable trade-off. Parliament passed the Adulteration of Food and Drink Act later that year. It was the first law in British history that defined food purity as a legal category and created any system of inspection at all. The law was weak. It relied on local authorities to hire chemical analysts, and most did not bother. But it established a principle the baking industry had successfully resisted for decades. Food could be regulated, and sellers could be held accountable for what they put in it. The real enforcement came in 1872 and 1875, when amended legislation required every local government to appoint a public analyst and gave inspectors the power to seize and test food samples without advance notice. Prosecutions followed. Bakers were fined, some were imprisoned. Measurable adulteration dropped sharply within a decade. But the transformation was not immediate or complete. Cheap bread still contained alum well into the 1880s. Small bakeries argued with some justification that they could not afford pure ingredients and remain in business. The market had been built on adulteration for so long that removing it required not just law, but a structural change in how bread was manufactured and distributed. Industrialization eventually resolved what regulation alone could not. Large commercial bakeries adopted mechanical mixers, standardized recipes, and bulk purchasing arrangements. Their scale reduced the cost per loaf far enough that adulterants became economically unnecessary. By 1900, major bakeries in Britain and the United States were advertising purity as a competitive advantage. The thing that had once been financially impossible to provide to the poor had become a marketing claim for the mass market. The legend of adulterated bread faded almost as fast as the practice itself. Within a generation, poisoned bread became something the Victorians had tolerated before science and progress arrived. That framing is misleading. The science had been available since Accum published his findings in 1820. The understanding of harm was well established by the 1850s. What was missing was not knowledge. What was missing was the political will to act on it, and the economic structure that would make acting on it possible without removing the only affordable food from the market. There is a detail worth noting about how the memory of this period was later processed. In 1966, an American author named R.W. Grant wrote a book of political commentary called The Incredible Bread Machine, built around a poem about a man who invents a machine that produces bread very cheaply, feeds the world, and is then prosecuted by his government for it. The poem used cheap bread as a symbol of market innovation, punished by regulation. It became widely cited in free market circles. What the poem did not engage with was the documented history of what cheap bread had actually contained before regulation arrived. That gap between the symbol and the substance is part of the story. Cheap bread has carried enormous ideological weight, as proof of abundance, as evidence of market efficiency, as the reward that civilization owes its working poor. None of that symbolism is wrong exactly, but it tends to skip the century in which cheap bread was reliably poisonous, and the regulatory effort that had to be built, contested, and enforced before the symbol could be trusted. Today, bread is among the most regulated foods on the market. Ingredients are declared, additives are tested and approved, inspectors enforce standards that would have seemed utopian in 1850. We inherit that safety without thinking about it, the same way we inherit clean water from a tap. It was not inherited, it was constructed, by chemists who published results that implicated their own profession's supply chain, by doctors who tracked injuries no one wanted to attribute to a staple food, by the families who buried children and could not prove why, and by a legal process that moved slowly, imperfectly, and only after a disaster dramatic enough to overcome the economic argument that had sheltered the practice for 60 years. The cheapest loaf in history was not a triumph of the market or a failure of it. It was the product of a system in which price was the only signal that mattered, until the cost of that system became undeniable. What changed was not the bread. What changed was who got to decide what the bread was allowed to contain.